An elderly man steps onto the plane, his cane tapping softly with each careful movement. As he walks down the narrow aisle, his shoes are worn and his jacket slightly frayed at the edges. The faint scent of cologne, mixed with the musty air of the cabin, surrounds him. He moves slowly, but with a certain grace despite his age. The other passengers hardly notice him, too caught up in their own world of last-minute preparations. And the rush to settle into their seats, the noise of rolling suitcases and hurried conversations fills the air. But he remains calm and quiet as he passes rows of passengers, each of them absorbed in their own thoughts, none of them giving him a second glance. His face is wrinkled from years of living, but his eyes, they hold a depth that tells stories of a time long past, a time most would prefer to forget. The weight of those years isn't something he hides, nor is it something he chooses to flaunt. It simply is his truth, a part of him, a part of who he is now. But none of the passengers seem to notice or care. He finds his seat in the middle section of the plane, looking down at the small space that will be his home for the next few hours. He moves carefully, shifting his belongings with precision, placing his small bag beneath the seat in front of him. With a practiced hand, he pulls out a newspaper, folding it neatly as he prepares to sit and wait for the flight to begin. There's a slight hesitation in his movements, like a man who's lived through enough to know that even the smallest of tasks requires patience. The overhead bins are already filled with bags, and there's a subtle bustle of people adjusting their things to make room for the latecomers. The man doesn't seem to mind it. He simply sits down, adjusting himself, slowly, his hands resting gently on his lap. As he leans back against the seat, there's a certain serenity to the way he settles in. It's the kind of peace that only comes after a lifetime of battles, both literal and metaphorical. As the cabin doors close, he looks out the window, catching a glimpse of the airport runway, bathed in the golden glow of the afternoon sun. He's been here before, too many times to count, though it's been a long while since he last flew. The years have caught up with him, and travel has become more of a challenge. But he's not one to complain. There's no one to help him with his bag, no one to offer a hand or a word of kindness. But he's learned long ago not to expect help from others in a world that moves too fast for its own good. With a quiet sigh, he folds his newspaper neatly and places it on the seat beside him. It's not the first time he's been overlooked, not the first time his age has made others dismiss him or treat him as invisible. He's lived through worse. The silence of his thoughts is interrupted by the loud voice of the flight attendant. As she walks down the aisle, her eyes scanning quickly from seat to seat, checking for any issues. Her hands are full with a clipboard and a few papers, but her gaze is sharp and her movements efficient. She stops for a moment beside him, and her eyes flicker over his figure. She notices his bag in the aisle blocking the path, and without pausing, she speaks to him in a sharp tone. "Sir, could you move your things, please? We're running behind." The words come out quick and matter-of-fact, as if he were just another obstacle to be dealt with. Her eyes don't linger on him, and she doesn't seem to notice the quiet dignity that rests in his posture, or the faintest hint of a war hero hidden beneath the faded fabric of his jacket. She waits impatiently for him to comply, her hand tapping the side of the cart in an almost irritated rhythm. She doesn't wait for a response before turning to walk down the aisle again, continuing her work, unaware that the man she just spoke to was someone whose life had been shaped by far more than the ordinary moments of daily life. The elderly man doesn't react. His hands tremble slightly as he reaches for his bag, but he moves without haste, his actions deliberate, steady. He knows the price of taking his time and the value of patience, even when it isn't offered in return. The flight attendant moves down the aisle with quick steps, her heels kicking sharply against the floor, her eyes darting from passenger to passenger, her thoughts focused on the job at hand, checking tickets and answering questions in a blur of motion. As the elderly man adjusts his bag, she doesn't notice his eyes following her as she moves farther away. He has seen this kind of haste before, the impatience, the rush of a world that doesn't stop for anyone But it doesn't bother him. He has learned to accept the hurried nature of life. It's a rhythm he's had to adapt to over the years. But something about the tone of her voice stirs something inside him, not anger, but a quiet sense of regret for a generation that's forgotten the value of slowing down and looking people in the eye. But he doesn't say anything, he doesn't argue or defend himself. He simply moves his bag with the same calm deliberation that has guided him through the many storms of his life. The passengers around him are still settling in. There's a sense of discomfort in the air. The tension between the flight attendant and the elderly man hanging like an unspoken cloud. One or two of the passengers glance over at him, seeing the small interaction. But no one speaks up, no one offers help. Instead, they look away, pretending they didn't notice the subtle brush of disrespect that had passed between the two. The man sits back in his seat, adjusting the collar of his jacket. His hand rests gently on the armrest, the leather worn from years of use. He looks out the window again as the plane begins its slow taxi toward the runway, his thoughts drifting away from the cramped cabin. And the modern world outside, he thinks back to a time when things were different, when he wore a different uniform. And the weight of his decisions meant something much larger than the space of an airplane seat. He remembers the quiet moments before the storm, the way the world seemed to hold its breath, before everything changed. He remembers the faces of those he fought beside, the ones who never made it home, and the ones who did, but were never quite the same when they stepped off the planes back on familiar soil. It's a bitter memory, but a necessary one. It's part of who he is, part of what made him the man he is now. But the world outside doesn't know that. They only see the old man sitting quietly in his seat. They don't see the stories etched into his heart, the scars carried from years of service. His fingers tremble slightly as he grips the armrest, a faint memory flickering in his mind. But he shakes it off, turning his gaze back to the window as the plane picks up speed on the runway. The hum of the engines grows louder, but the noise is almost soothing. It reminds him of a time when he would hear these sounds while waiting for orders, his hands clenched around the controls, ready to face whatever came next. But now there's no need for that, no need for the tension of life or death decisions. The battles fought on foreign soil, now the battles are quieter. They are fought in the comfort of a chair and the silence of a plane's cabin. He settles into his seat as the plane climbs higher into the sky. But his thoughts don't stay on the clouds ahead. They drift back to a time when the world was different, a time when he was different, a time when he had a purpose. Beyond the quiet moments of reflection, the flight attendant passes by again. This time her face is more focused. She's checking seatbelts and making sure everyone is secure. Her eyes flicker over him once again. But she doesn't stop. She's already moving on to the next task. The next passenger, her world too fast for her to notice what lies beneath the surface of the elderly man sitting quietly in his seat. The flight attendant continues down the aisle, her footsteps echoing as she moves past the elderly man without another word, her focus entirely on her duties. She's already forgotten about him in the chaos of her responsibilities. The elderly man remains seated, his hands resting on his lap, his eyes fixed on the view outside the window, the world below growing smaller and smaller with every passing second. But he doesn't seem to notice the shrinking landscape. His mind is elsewhere, far away in the past. The flight attendant doesn't see the small details, the wear on his clothes, the slow but deliberate way he moves, the quiet dignity he carries with him. She doesn't recognize the insignia on his jacket, the faded symbols of honor and sacrifice. She doesn't know that the man sitting quietly beside her was once a soldier who risked everything to save lives in a war long gone by. She doesn't know that his bravery and courage once kept him in the heart of battle, and that he had lived through more than most could ever imagine. The passengers around them remain absorbed in their own worlds, some chatting softly, others staring at their screens or reading books. But none of them notice the elderly man. No one looks at him closely enough to see the quiet strength in his face, or the sorrow that lingers in his eyes even as he holds himself with such calm composure. The attendant continues moving down the aisle, checking seat belts. and making sure everything is in order. Her mind still focused on the logistics of the flight, she glances over the elderly man one more time, but she doesn't pause this time. Her eyes flicker over him. Without a second thought, she's too busy to care about the people around her, too focused on making sure everything is perfect for the passengers. She doesn't see the man's stoic expression, the depth of his past that rests beneath the surface. And as the flight goes on, the whispers start to spread. It begins with a passenger, a woman sitting across the aisle. She looks over at the elderly man, studying him carefully, her gaze lingering on his military jacket. She leans in closer to her husband and whispers something to him. They both exchange glances, and then the woman pulls out her phone, quietly typing something into the search bar. The husband watches his wife's face intently. As she scrolls through the screen, her eyes widen slightly as she taps on an image and shows it to him. The man's face appears in the photo worn and weathered, but unmistakable. The woman's voice drops to a whisper. "It's him, isn't it?" The husband leans over to get a better look. "Yes, that's the one, the war hero." The woman nods in disbelief, her eyes never leaving the screen. "He saved so many people in that mission," she says, her voice full of awe and respect. The husband nods solemnly. "I've heard stories of him," he says, his tone low. "He was a legend." The whispers spread like wildfire through the cabin, passengers leaning in to confirm what they had suspected, murmuring about the elderly man's past. The flight attendant overhears the hushed voices as she walks down the aisle again. This time her pace slows slightly as she hears the words "war hero" repeated over and over. The weight of the realization begins to settle in her chest. The man she had been so impatient with, the man she had dismissed without a second thought, was not just any elderly passenger. He was someone whose bravery and sacrifice had shaped the course of history. She turns her head, subtly trying to glimpse his face from a distance. But he doesn't look at her. He's still gazing out the window, his expression unreadable. The cabin feels different now, quieter. Somehow the tension in the air has shifted from discomfort to awe. As the truth begins to spread, she feels the eyes of the passengers on her, the realization dawning too late to undo her actions, too late to apologize for the sharp words she had used when she had treated him like just another inconvenience in the rush of her job. She wants to go to him, to say something to make it right, but the words don't come. They are stuck in her throat, her mind racing with regret. As the whispers continue to grow louder in the cabin, the weight of what she has done sinking deeper with each passing second. The flight attendant tries to shake off the growing unease in her chest, but it lingers like a heavy weight. She forces herself to focus on her duties, her hands moving mechanically as she checks seat belts and hands out drinks, but her mind keeps drifting back to the elderly man. She can feel the eyes of the passengers on her, their silent judgment echoing through the air. They know what she doesn't, they know who he is, and now she does too. But it's too late. She can't undo what's already been said, or how she had treated him. Her actions feel like an unshakable stain, and no matter how much she tries to hide it, the guilt doesn't fade. As the minutes tick by, the tension in the cabin seems to grow. The whispers around her become more frequent, passengers now openly discussing the elderly man's identity, some even pulling up pictures of him from their phones. One of them recalls an old news story about a heroic mission he had been part of decades ago. His face appearing on the screen, surrounded by soldiers. The man's name is murmured, and a hushed reverence fills the air. But the attendant's thoughts are elsewhere. She can't escape the image of his face, the way his eyes had looked out the window, as if lost in a memory, something so far away, but so present at the same time. She wishes she could turn back time just a few moments to when she had first spoken to him, to when she could have approached the situation differently. She could have shown more patience, more respect. But now the moment had passed, and all she could do was watch as the realization spread across the cabin like wildfire. The elderly man remains as he was throughout the ordeal, calm and quiet, his gaze never once shifting from the window. But now his presence feels different. It's as if the weight of his history has taken on a new meaning in the eyes of the passengers, who now look at him with awe and admiration. They no longer see him as just an old man traveling to some distant place. They see a hero, someone whose courage had shaped the very fabric of their world. And the flight attendant can't help but feel a deep sense of regret as she watches the man's stoic silence. She wonders if he even remembers the moment she had spoken to him so sharply, or if it had all been lost in the distance of time. Perhaps to him it was nothing, just another interaction in a long life, filled with more significant events. But to her it feels like a wound that won't heal. She glances at him again, but he doesn't meet her gaze. His eyes are focused on something far beyond the confines of the plane, something far beyond the rushed chaos of the flight. She can't help but wonder if he's thinking about those lost moments, those faces of soldiers who never made it home, or the missions that were too dangerous to talk about, or the price of bravery that had been paid long ago. She takes a deep breath and moves to the back of the cabin, trying to focus on the rest of her duties. But the guilt follows her like a shadow. It's with her in every step, every interaction she has with the passengers, who no longer seem to notice her. They are too absorbed in their own realization of who the man beside them is. But she can't escape the weight of her mistake. She wants to go to him to apologize, to somehow make things right. But she can't find the courage. Her throat feels tight, and her hands are cold. She walks back down the aisle, hoping the moment will pass. But deep down she knows it won't. The feeling of regret is too strong. And as the plane continues its journey, the flight attendant's thoughts remain fixed on the elderly man sitting quietly in his seat, the hero who had been humiliated without reason. The flight begins to settle into its rhythm, the hum of the engines and the soft chatter of the passengers forming a background to the growing silence between the flight attendant and the elderly man. She moves down the aisle again. This time her steps are slower, more hesitant, as if the weight of her actions has made her unsure of herself. She glances over at the elderly man, his eyes still fixed out the window. His posture remains unchanged, calm, unbothered. But she can't help but feel the heaviness of his presence. Now the realization about him has spread like wildfire through the cabin. The passengers have stopped whispering, and instead sit in quiet awe, watching him, as if waiting for something, a gesture, a sign that he knows they know his identity. But he remains still, his hands folded in his lap, his face impassive to the attention that now surrounds him. The flight attendant stops for a moment in the aisle, her eyes lingering on the elderly man. She feels a knot form in her stomach, and for a brief second she wonders if he's aware of her gaze, if he feels the weight of her guilt pressing down on her. The minutes pass like hours, and she can't shake the feeling that she is somehow trapped in the same moment, that she has to live with this mistake forever. She takes a deep breath and tries to focus on the tasks ahead, but every movement feels mechanical, every action hollow. The passengers are still looking at him, not with the casual disinterest they had before, but with reverence, a silent respect that she can no longer ignore. Her heart races as she wonders what it must feel like for the elderly man to be suddenly recognized like this, a man whose heroism had been long forgotten by the world, only to be unearthed in the quiet space of a plane filled with strangers. She wonders if he's thinking of those days, the days of battles fought and lives saved, or if he's simply used to the quiet admiration that has followed him for decades. But for the flight attendant, it feels like the moment is dragging on too long. She wishes she could rewind time and say something different, wish she could take back the words that had been so sharp and cold. Her stomach churns as the realization hits her again that she humiliated someone who deserved none of it. She had no idea who he was or what he had done, what kind of life he had lived, the sacrifices he had made. But all she had seen was an elderly man struggling to keep up with the pace of the flight, and in that moment she had forgotten that not every battle is fought in the present. Some battles are fought long ago, and still echo through the years. She finds herself standing there, frozen in place, watching the elderly man, his face still set in the same quiet expression, as if nothing had changed. But everything has changed. The whole cabin feels different now, the air heavy with the weight of this unspoken truth that he is someone to be revered, someone whose legacy is larger than any of them could ever comprehend. She feels the heat of shame rise in her chest as the finality of her mistake settles in. She wants to apologize, but the words don't come. They get caught in her throat. Too late. She thinks it's too late to make things right. The elderly man shifts slightly in his seat, and for a moment she wonders if he's going to speak to her. But he doesn't. Instead, his eyes stay fixed on the window. The flight attendant can feel the gaze of the passengers on her. They are all waiting for her to do something, anything, to acknowledge the man sitting quietly in his seat. But she remains silent, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to make amends. When the moment for forgiveness has already passed, the silence stretches on, and the tension in the air becomes almost unbearable. The flight continues, but for the flight attendant, it feels as if time has stopped, as if she is trapped in a moment where she cannot undo the past, and no amount of words can heal the mistake she has made. The flight continues onward, the quiet hum of the engines, a steady reminder of the time passing. But for the flight attendant, it feels as if everything has slowed down, her mind racing with thoughts of regret, and the heavy realization that she cannot undo what has been done. She watches the elderly man out of the corner of her eye, but he remains as he always has, still and composed, his gaze fixed on the window, as if he is lost in some distant memory, his presence almost silent now that the cabin has quieted. But she can feel the shift in the atmosphere, the respect the passengers now show him. It's as if the world around her has changed, and she's still trying to catch up. She wants to go to him, to say something, anything, but the words won't come. They are stuck in her throat, like a knot she can't untie. Instead, she moves back down the aisle, her hands trembling slightly as she checks on the passengers. She knows she should be doing her job, but her thoughts keep drifting back to the elderly man and the mistake she made. She wonders if he even cares, if he remembers what happened earlier, or if he's too used to being treated this way by those who don't know his story. But she can't shake the feeling that she's wrong, that she should have treated him differently, that she should have shown him the respect he deserved from the very beginning. The flight attendant's footsteps echo softly through the cabin, but she feels heavy with the guilt of the situation. She watches as the passengers begin to talk to one another in hushed tones about the elderly man, each one trying to piece together the details of his story, some of them even searching for articles or photos of him on their phones as they connect the dots. One woman speaks in awe. He saved so many people. She whispers to her husband, her voice trembling with admiration. I remember reading about that mission when I was younger. The husband nods in agreement. He was one of the best, they say. The conversation spreads through the rows like wildfire, and soon everyone seems to know who the elderly man is. They all seem to know what he's done, and the weight of it hangs in the air like a silent tribute to a man who has lived a lifetime of courage and sacrifice. The flight attendant hears the murmurs of admiration growing louder and louder, and with each word spoken she feels smaller and smaller. The passengers are no longer just looking at him, they are honoring him in their own quiet way. They are acknowledging the hero who sits among them, unaware of the way they have come to see him. But she is acutely aware of the mistake she made, and the shame that she can't seem to shake. She moves toward the back of the plane again, this time slower, more deliberate, as if trying to distance herself from the realization that the man she had been so quick to dismiss is someone whose life has been defined by far more than she could ever imagine. She stands by the galley and watches as the elderly man remains seated, his hands folded calmly in his lap, his eyes still fixed on the world outside the window. She wants to approach him, but the fear of further humiliating herself keeps her frozen in place. She wonders if he will speak to her, if he will look at her, if he will somehow acknowledge the words she had spoken to him earlier. But there is no movement from him, no indication that he is aware of her internal struggle. His silence is both a comfort and a torment. She feels the weight of his quiet dignity pressing down on her, like a reminder that he doesn't need anyone's recognition. He has lived a life that has already spoken for itself. While she stands here feeling small and insignificant, in comparison the hours pass, and the plane inches closer to its destination. But the tension remains thick in the air. The flight attendant is lost in her thoughts, unable to shake the guilt. She feels she tries to focus on her duties, but it's difficult to ignore the quiet respect that has enveloped the elderly man, the passengers who now look at him with reverence. But she knows the truth. She knows the hero that he is, but she also knows the mistake she made in not seeing it sooner. She can't undo the past, but the regret will stay with her long after the flight has ended, long after the elderly man has left the plane. The plane begins its descent, and the soft hum of the engines gradually changes the atmosphere. The flight attendants begin to prepare for landing, but the weight of the moment still lingers in the cabin. The elderly man is still seated. His eyes are now turned slightly to the side as he watches the city below come into focus, the golden light of the setting sun casting a warm glow over the landscape. The passengers are quiet now, all of them waiting for the landing, but none of them have forgotten the man who sits among them. They glance over at him with a sense of reverence, some of them still whispering quietly to one another about his past, some even looking for a chance to speak with him, to acknowledge his heroism. But the elderly man remains unaware of the attention around him. He is in his own world, lost in the memories of days gone by, a lifetime spent in service to something greater than himself. The flight attendant moves toward the front of the plane, her heart heavy as she prepares for the final moments of the flight. She tries to push the guilt aside, but it doesn't go away. It stays with her like an unwanted shadow, following her every step. She moves with practiced ease, checking on the passengers, fastening seat belts. But her mind is miles away. It keeps returning to that moment, when she had been so quick to dismiss him, when she had failed to see the significance of who he was, or what he had done. She had assumed so much based on his age, his frailness, his quiet demeanor. But now she knows better. Now she understands that heroes do not always wear capes or carry medals. Sometimes they simply sit quietly among us, unnoticed, until it is too late for us to realize the value of their presence. As the plane begins to touch down, she sees the elderly man out of the corner of her eye, his face still calm, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his expression unchanged by the flurry of activity around him. His life has been lived. He has seen things most people could never even dream of. And now he sits here, just like anyone else. But unlike anyone else, there is a quiet power in the way he carries himself. It is not the power of words or actions, but the power of experience, of having lived through things that have shaped him into the man he is today. The flight attendant takes a deep breath as the plane touches the runway, the finality of the moment pressing in on her. She watches as the passengers begin to gather their things, preparing to disembark. But she doesn't move, not yet. She lingers in the aisle as everyone else gets up and heads toward the door. Her heart beats a little faster. Now the time has come for the flight to end, and with it her chance to do something to right the wrong she feels inside. But still she hesitates. She knows that an apology would mean little now, that the damage is done. What can she say after all the passengers have come to know his story, after all the murmurs and whispers have filled the cabin with the truth about who he is? What can she say that would make any difference at this point? She can't erase her actions. She can't change the way she treated him. But still she can't shake the feeling that she owes him something more than just an apology. She owes him the recognition that she failed to give him earlier. She owes him the respect that she should have shown from the moment he stepped onto the plane. But the elderly man does not look at her as the passengers begin to file out of the plane. He doesn't acknowledge her presence. He doesn't seem to notice the way the entire cabin has changed since the moment of realization When the truth about who he is came to light, the flight attendant watches him for a long moment. He stands slowly and gathers his things. He moves with purpose. But there is a certain slowness to his movements, as if his body is weary from years of living, the weight of his experiences heavy on his shoulders. He steps into the aisle and pauses for a moment, his eyes finally lifting toward her. But there is no judgment in them, only quiet understanding, as if he has seen this all before. The flight attendant takes a breath and finally steps forward, her voice soft and hesitant but genuine. "Sir, I just wanted to say thank you." She says the words feeling small in comparison to the magnitude of what she feels. "Thank you for your service." The elderly man pauses as he hears her words, his gaze lingering on her face for a moment, as if he's trying to make sense of the apology that she's offered. He seems to study her with quiet scrutiny, but there's no anger in his eyes, no resentment, just a calm understanding, as if he has been here before. And he knows the struggle of regret when it strikes too late. The flight attendant feels her heart pounding in her chest. She wonders if her words are enough, if they carry any weight after everything that's happened. But then the elderly man speaks, his voice low and steady, but filled with a warmth that surprises her. "It's all right." He says his words simple, but they carry an almost unspoken depth. "You didn't know?" He continues, his gaze never leaving her face. And for a moment she feels as if the weight of her mistake has been lifted just slightly, but the guilt remains a quiet hum in the back of her mind. The man looks down at his bag and adjusts the straps before looking back at her with a soft smile that seems to radiate more kindness than she deserves. "I've lived a long time," he says, "and I've had many moments where I've been misunderstood, sometimes by the people I've fought for, sometimes by the people I've fought beside." His voice is tinged with something almost sorrowful, but there's no bitterness. It's part of life. He finishes quietly. The flight attendant is taken aback by his words, and for the first time since the flight began, she feels the smallest hint of relief, a sense that perhaps she hasn't completely lost her chance to make things right, that maybe there's room for growth, even in the smallest of interactions. She wants to say more, to thank him for his understanding, but her throat feels tight, as if the emotions she's been holding back all this time are finally catching up to her. She swallows hard and nods. "I didn't mean to. I wasn't trying to offend you," she says softly, her voice faltering but earnest. I didn't know." He smiles again, but this time it's softer, warmer, almost reassuring. "It's all right," he repeats, his eyes twinkling with something almost playful. "Sometimes the world moves faster than we can keep up." He says with a shrug, as if to suggest that it's not always the mistakes that matter, but how we learn from them. She stands there for a long moment, unsure of what to say next, as the last few passengers begin to leave the plane, the noise of the bustling cabin starting to fill the space around them. But it feels like a world away. The elderly man stands in the aisle, now shifting his weight slightly as he looks out into the distance, his posture still as dignified as ever. "Take care of yourself," he says with a final glance back at her, before he turns and walks toward the door, his steps slow but steady, as if he is accustomed to long journeys, not just the physical kind, but the kind that take years to complete. The flight attendant watches him go, her heart still heavy, but somehow lighter than before. She is left standing in the aisle for a moment longer, watching him disappear into the crowd of passengers ahead of her, but his presence remains with her in the stillness of the cabin, as if the entire plane had felt the weight of who he was, and who he had been, a man whose story had shaped lives in ways no one would ever truly know. She breathes deeply and looks around the cabin. The murmurs have faded, the passengers, now fully aware of the man they had shared a flight with, their expressions softer, their minds filled with the respect they hadn't known they would feel for him. The flight attendant moves back toward the front of the plane. She feels a sense of peace wash over her, a quiet acknowledgement that while she couldn't undo the past, she could learn from it. She looks out the window one last time, as the plane reaches the gate, and she knows that this will not be the last time. She will think of the elderly man, the hero, who taught her the value of slowing down and seeing the person in front of you before it's too late.